All right, here's my most recent essay about porches. So, porch is the word I define and then build the rest of the essay around. Porch, a covered walkway, often preceded by steps. From the Latin porta, meaning city gate, a door, or entrance. From the Proto-Indo-European root per, meaning to lead or to pass over. Like you would a threshold into the safe confines of your home, or out into the unknown, where a new, prosperous voyage awaits. Picture this, if you will. It is early in the morning, late in the 4th century. A young merchant upstart, Zeno of Citium and Cyprus, sets foot on his family's trade ship, transporting an extremely valuable cargo, Tyrian purple dye, extracted as it was then from the blood of sea snails, then dried. With that consignment, he sets sail across the Mediterranean, but only to suffer shipwreck amid a tremendous storm. He survives. Kicking and paddling his way to the nearest shore, the port of Athens, he then proceeds to watch his future, that financial security derived from the sea, return to the sea, in a poetic example of provident embargo. What the gods give, they can also take away. Emotionally spent, physically exhausted, financially devastated, Zeno heads into town, perhaps to drown his sorrows at the local pub and eatery. Instead, he finds himself drawn to a local bookstore where, I imagine, he stares for a time at his reflection in the glass door before finally venturing in. A bell over the door rings. Someone behind the counter greets him, but he is too preoccupied to notice. As if pushed from behind, he steps past the coffee and the pastries and the magazines, then down a particular aisle to a particular shelf, the founding fathers of philosophy, and then a particular book, Memorabilia, by one Xenophon, friend and student of Socrates 100 years earlier. It is, of course, chock full of Socratic dialogue, but it is between the lines that Zeno senses behind his lowest point a higher purpose. Over a sticky bear claw and the unexamined life is not worth living, he decides to give up the family business and become, in time, a peddler, not of goods, but of good. A preacher of sorts from whom humankind can glean, then take the necessary steps to achieve, through the development of self-control and fortitude, a life of virtue worth living. It is not long after, and not far from that bookstore, on the north side of the Agora, Athens' oldest supermall, as it were, that Zeno, 42 years old, establishes a school and begins to offer to window shoppers young and old his new philosophy, Zenoism. But that is too pretentious, he decides. So he instead begins referring to it as Stoicism, derived from the name of the platform on which he often taught, the famous Stoa Poikil, meaning the painted porch, owing its fame in part to the numerous paintings and wartime loot displayed across its steps, but also to the teachings of Zeno. Sayings like, "Man conquers the world by conquering himself," and "I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered shipwreck," and my favorite most of all, "Happiness is a good flow of life." Of course, regarding the metaphor in this last bit of wisdom, and in a strictly nautical sense, one cannot mention a tide's flow without considering its ebb. In other words, there can be no incoming without an outgoing, no rising without first a fall. I think of this today, 42 years old, just like Zeno. Standing on the front steps in a white robe, also like Zeno. Philosophizing before an audience of one, maybe like Zeno, at least at first. Saying things like, "I already give you an allowance, son. I allow you to live here for free. And my presence is all the presence you need. And yes, you can use my new truck, but please follow the rules this time. No food, no vaping, no dead animals. Don't forget to turn down the bass when you're done. And no more hitting sage hens on purpose, okay?" Which I don't think is very much like Zeno. No, not at all. I hand my second oldest the keys, then watch as that metal half-ton pickup takes him and his friends away from me. They are not even out of the driveway, and I can already hear the bass rumbling alongside their animated intonations. Once soprano, but now also bass. Very, very bass. My other three dark-haired audience members are gone for the day too. So I pull up a patio chair, then take just a moment to breathe in the constant, crazy, clumsy, comely, grace-filled flow of life. The concrete porch about me is painted in chalk, anagrams from weeks ago like Jacob, Jacob, Jock, awesome, cool, omnipotent, brilliant, and Andrew, Andrew, awesome, nice, deadly with kung fu, rad, excellent, weird. And finally, Dad, D-A-D, dude, awesome, and decholesterolization. But also, and more typically on the porch, things written like so-and-so stinks and any number of word variations with but in them. Boys. Of course, when they were younger, they'd leave more than scribbled words on the porch. Toy cars, action figures, sandals, swim goggles, swim towels, swim trunks, swim diapers. Hey, who's not wearing their diaper? Shell collections, rock collections, leaf collections, stick collections, magnifying glasses, the periodic empty peanut butter bucket turned terrarium, scores of ladybugs and roly-polies having all escaped from that same terrarium, and the occasional frog cadaver having not been fortunate enough to escape the confines of the little fist that loved so much it did not want to put it into the terrarium. And then, as they got older, basketballs and footballs, fishing poles and compound bows, school backpacks and phones and girls' numbers and childhood. Yes, somehow in a trice, childhood seamlessly slipped out of like one does with well-worn shoes just before crossing the threshold because your boots are muddy, buddy, and you will track it all through the house and your mom just swept and she'll be mad. Not to mention all of the objects left on the porch by our cats and dogs, which expansive list I will condense to just this: lots and lots of birds and mice, or at least their heads, and the occasional random foot or wing or a tail, and once a spleen, at least I think it was a spleen, carefully laid out across the welcome mat next to the morning Times like some sacrificial offering. This rudimentary expression of gratitude from mammal to man. Thank you for allowing us to live here for free. See, the animals get it. Leaving things behind, though, was not just limited to boys and pets either. No, over the years, my porch has seen countless people drop off other things too, like packages and plates of cookies and political propaganda and promposals, sometimes in broad daylight, other times under the cloak of darkness, hiding their identity out of the need for surprise, but sometimes also in shame. Like those few exuberant gardeners in my neighborhood, my wife among them. But in particular, a friend of mine who loved gardening, especially zucchinis, but who hated eating all things vegetable, and as a result, spent half his fall trying to pawn off these giant gourds on unsuspecting neighbors. Which seems akin to having 50 kids because you like planting seeds and all, but then dropping them off on the orphanage steps because you never liked kids to begin with. To which I say, for gourd's sake, enough, and then call for responsible, planned gardening. Fruit, on the other hand, was and is always welcome on my porch. Like the tangerines delivered to my childhood home a few days before Christmas, because in the throes of poverty, rarely a holiday went by without my siblings and I dashing for the door to catch some covert contributor, only to see instead several silhouettes slipping stealthily into the shadows. And then, under our own shadows, on the porch, certain gifts or cards with money or a turkey or a Christmas tree, and once that box of tangerines, that whole box of tangerines. All of them like little balls of fire flickering in my parents' twinkling eyes. Which brings to mind an elderly gentleman who used to live not far from where I live now, and who, as the story goes, worked his garden and orchard tirelessly, for no other reason than to offer up to strangers the literal fruits of his labor, because his wife was gone 15 years now, And she loved to make things grow, and boy, she was good at it too. And I'm getting a little too shaky to get up and down like I used to, but here, have some apples. They were her favorite. From my land to your hand, from my heart to your hearth. But for everything left on my porch, it is the intangibles, not the tangerines, that have influenced me most. The silence and the sniffles, the hellos and the goodbyes, the hugs and the kisses, even the near hugs and the near kisses. Like the awkward ones from my elementary days, which is to say, there was, on one particular day at least, a very shy 8-year-old boy standing on a very shy 8-year-old girl's porch, looking anywhere but her eyes. And largely silent except for an occasional nervous giggle and maybe a question or two about homework or what the latest recess data said about the chances of successful 4th grade inter-school dating. All with one parent not so secretly watching from the window, and from around the corner, her older sibling singing Kissing. And then when they got to the part about a baby carriage, her downturned eyes and my cheeks red with embarrassment and rage, followed very soon after by, I think you're really, really pretty, but I gotta go by. And then, waning in the distance, matching the cadence of my beating heart, the sound of a folded baseball card skipping over my bicycle spokes. Not to be outdone by that real hug and real kiss almost a decade later. The gentle ones at the end of my junior year in high school, by the beach in the port city where I lived, when I said goodbye to my dear friend the night before she moved out of the country for good. Except her leaving wasn't really good at all. Not for me, anyway. She had already packed her bags, but I had only managed to pack up my emotions. I was not ready to let her go, and yet, somehow, I did. Just the two of us, away from the noise of the farewell party, only the give and take of the tide when I took her in my arms, pressed my cheek atop her head, and then there too placed my dry, quiet lips, which was to say, I love you. Though she would never know, because it was not until I was in the car on my way home that my heart, like an overstuffed portmanteau, sprung open wide, spilling its contents all down the side. As was the case a couple years later, in the early morning hours when it was me leaving the country this time and my brother meeting me halfway down the outside steps, where we then embraced like we had never embraced before. And I can still recall his bony chest against mine, followed by the emboldened, I love you, brother. And then, upon letting go, receiving from my dad a similar hug, followed by the rare, more emboldened kiss on my cheek, which needed no words of explanation then, and needs them not now. And then, 4 years after that, at the gateway to her apartment complex, when I looked into the eyes of the girl who had just told me she loved me back, those eyes the color of the Pacific Ocean, then closed mine and leaned in for our first kiss. And then, not even a breath later, our second. And then, one more time, our third. Of course, not many days later, there was that long continuous one too, but with greater fervor this time, like a storm, which whirlwind of emotions led to another date, and then another, and then eventually a wedding altar, followed by the honeymoon, which, in its own right, led to the crossing of a different kind of threshold, the highest, holiest form of together, that ebb and flow by which we eventually created 4 beautiful babies, 4 instances of precious cargo, all of them wrapped up tightly and smothered in kisses as we carefully carried them up the stairs, onto the porch, through the door, then into our heart and home. Which is why it hurt so much, 20 years later, when the doorbell rang and I found myself walking beside my wife to answer the door, but only to be invited onto the porch, where she then served me divorce papers and said, in essence, not only do I not love you back, but I never did. As if struck by a bolt of lightning, I stumbled back across the threshold and into the living room, where my kids fell into my arms and I into theirs, and we hugged and kissed and sobbed like we never had before, even the most stoic among the group. No, especially the most stoic. How the storm proceeded from there is beyond the scope of this essay, other than to say It proceeded, like terrible storms do. But somehow, I survived. Somehow, out of the murky depths, I kicked and I paddled. I kicked and I paddled. I kicked and I paddled until I found my footing, from where I watched in disbelief the sinking of my future and my finances. But then, more inland, so to speak, where I am now, working to be able to say with greater confidence and peace, from this fall I will rise. What the gods take, they can give again. And from this shipwreck will a new and prosperous voyage be realized. Which brings me back to Zeno, and to the end of all our adventures, heaven, but this time past the pearly gates, to the neighborhoods where everyone owns a mansion of various construction, and where, thank the landlord, he allows us to live rent-free. Which is where, picture this if you will, I see myself, early in the morning, stepping onto the porch to get the Times, and across the way, maybe Zeno, also stepping onto his porch, dressed in a royal robe of Tyrian purple, who then, for a second anyway, loses his cool, mumbling under his breath, "This can't be heaven, this can't be heaven," because he can't seem to find his own copy of the newspaper on account of the scores of zucchini covering his porch, and stealing away around the corner to the next unsuspecting neighbor, my friend, the gardener, who, by all accounts, is blown away by the principle of eternal increase. "And all from one seed," he sings in disbelief, pausing to look back at his heaven-issued wagon ever flowing with gourds of one kind or another. The man at the next house, though, he motions for the gardener to move along, then takes from the hand of the woman next to him a shiny red apple, and then in his own hand, her hand, from my heart to your hearth. In encouragement, I shout to my friend the gardener, then point down the way to the home of someone I once knew well and still know well, a girl who loves zucchini, who, I tell him, will gladly accept his vegetable offering. And she does. Both love them and accept them. So it is. I watch as she hands them to her second husband, reminds him to kick off his muddy shoes before taking them into the house, then nods across the way for me to join her on a walk. And I do. Around the block, around another block, then down the main street to the celestial center of the city, the angelic Agora, which has as its own center a pool, like Bethesda, which place, according to the Bible, has 5 porches, and whose waters have healing properties, and where, accordingly, we sit down to dip in our toes. Around us, the steps boast loot of one kind or another. We talk of good times and hard times. We talk a lot of hard times, but then good times again. Yes, especially the good times. And as we talk, her fingers are drawn to a piece of chalk among the memorabilia. She breaks it in two, hands half to me. Without words, without prompting, we begin writing the full names of our children. She takes the younger two. I spell out the names of the older ones. They each begin differently, but they end the same. And then, as if summoned, there they are, suddenly surrounding us, like in days of old, but this time with spouses and children of their own, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, and on and on and on, and the youngest among them, much to the chagrin of their parents, then toss aside their robes and begin to do cannonballs into the holy reservoir, which brash act stirs the once calm waters, causing them to surge and sway, to rise and fall, back and forth, ebb and flow, lapping at our naked ankles, this good flow of life. A life, for all its moments of incredibly deep heartache, filled wholly with inexpressible joy. A life of virtue worth living.